The farmhouse stood on a low ridge outside Montpellier, surrounded by fields that never quite seemed to yield enough, and a forest that leaned too close to its walls. The shutters stayed closed most days, and the villagers noticed that the chimney exhaled at strange hours of the night, as if the house itself breathed in rhythm with something inside. Those who walked by on winter evenings swore they could hear a faint hum from within, steady and soft, like a lullaby drawn out by unseen lips. They told each other it was only the wind in the flues, yet none dared linger long enough to prove it true. Inside the house lay the woman who did not wake. She had fallen into her sleep in 1862, a sudden collapse after a Sunday service, her hands still folded in prayer when her brother Silas carried her home. At first, neighbors came with casseroles and whispered prayers, touching her forehead, hoping she would stir, but she did not. She lay still, her chest rising just enough to keep death from being declared, her skin warm as if fevered but never breaking into sweat. Days turned into weeks, then months, and the people outside began to murmur. They said perhaps she was a saint, chosen by God to rest until the world was ready for her return. Others said it was punishment, a spell cast for sins the family would never speak aloud. Whatever truth existed, her brother refused to share it. Silas kept the house locked, drawing curtains tight so no light would fall upon her face. He devoted himself to her body with a devotion that seemed holy from afar. He laundered her sheets every morning, boiling water until the whole house reeked of lye. He brushed her hair in long, exact strokes, counting each one until he was satisfied. He turned her gently each hour, his large hands cradling her weight with the tenderness of a man holding something fragile and sacred. And yet beneath his tenderness lived an obsession. He recorded the warmth of her skin with a thermometer he calibrated daily, noting the precise degree in thick ledgers that grew heavy with dust. He timed her breathing with a pocket watch, marking the seconds between each inhale and exhale. If the rhythm shifted even slightly, he would spend hours pacing the floor, convinced that a hidden presence was pressing down upon her. The villagers said the bed never cooled. When her brother changed the linens, steam lifted as if her body carried the heat of an oven. Even in January, when frost clung to the windows and the air inside bit the lungs, her chamber was stifling. Some believed he stoked hidden fires beneath the floor, but no wood was ever seen carried inside. Others whispered of relics buried beneath the bedstead, charms or bones that kept her suspended between life and death. When they asked Silas, he only said that God had placed her in his keeping and he would not betray that trust. Time stretched. Her body did not age as it should have. By the 5th year, neighbors expected her hair to gray or her cheeks to hollow, but she remained as she had been that day in church. A young woman in her 20s with smooth skin and a softness about her lips that suggested she might speak at any moment. Mothers began to warn their children against walking too close to the house. Men spoke of her as a curiosity, a carnival exhibit that might draw crowds if Silas allowed it, though none dared press him. Women whispered of darker things, wondering why her brother lived alone with her, and whether God truly blessed a bond so unnatural. Still, Silas endured. He spoke of her as though she were present, nodding at her bed as if receiving counsel. He refused offers of farmhands or companions, insisting no other hands could be trusted near her. Every gesture, every ritual deepened the sense that the farmhouse was no longer simply a home, but a shrine. Yet shrines often mask graves. In his silence, the people felt unease harden into dread. By the close of the first decade, the story of the sleeping woman traveled beyond Montpellier. Doctors rode in from Boston, mesmerists from New York, even preachers from the revival circuits who claimed she was proof of either miracle or devil. None stayed long. They emerged from the darkened room shaken, unwilling to discuss what they had seen. They described her flesh as strangely resistant, as if the muscles did not yield beneath their probing. They spoke of eyes that fluttered beneath lids in frantic dreams, though her face remained placid as stone. Silas thanked them politely and showed them the door, keeping his records and his silence. The house exhaled once more into the Vermont night, the bed never cooling, the woman never waking. What seemed at first like care had begun to reveal itself as possession, and the line between devotion and desecration blurred further with each passing year. The stage was set, though the worst of it had yet to come. Silas Harlow's house became more than a dwelling. It became an altar, and he its priest. To the outside world he was a devoted brother, a man condemned to the thankless task of caring for a sister who never woke. Neighbors brought him bread and wood in the early years, touched by his loneliness and left with praise on their lips. They said his hands were gentle, that he lived with patience most men would not bear. Yet the truth was not patience, it was ritual, and ritual, when left unchecked, always hungers for more. Each morning he entered her chamber at the same hour. He lit a candle, not for light, but for sequence. The flame was always touched to the wick with his left hand, never the right. He whispered the Lord's Prayer as he opened the curtains no more than an inch, allowing the faintest sliver of daylight. Then he approached her bed and placed a hand above her chest, never touching, waiting for the rhythm of breath that only he could trust. If the breath faltered, he counted aloud until it steadied, convinced that his numbers anchored her to the world. He recorded every detail in journals so thick their bindings split, volumes stacked against the wall like the stones of a tomb. Feeding her became an act not of kindness but of calculation. He boiled milk with crushed oats, measuring each spoonful on a brass scale. If a drop spilled, he poured the entire bowl away, muttering that God demanded precision. He forced the mixture between her lips with a reed tube, pressing her throat until she swallowed. When her body twitched, he smiled as though she had answered him. If she did not, he struck her chest sharply, once, twice, until her breath caught. He called this correction. He believed error invited death, and death would mean betrayal. Cleaning her body was no less violent. Twice daily he stripped her bare and scrubbed her skin with rags dipped in salt water. He scoured until the skin reddened, sometimes until it bled, telling himself infection lurked in every pore. Her hair he combed until strands tore from the scalp. Then he tucked the torn pieces into jars labeled with dates, convinced each held part of her soul. He trimmed her nails with a razor and burned the clippings in the hearth, fearful that witches might steal them. Every fragment of her body, living or shed, was catalogued, stored, or destroyed under his command. He called this devotion, but in truth it was dominion. He ruled her body as if it were a kingdom, and he the sovereign who must defend it against corruption. The villagers who visited saw only the clean sheets, the brushed hair, the faint glow of lamplight, and they praised his sacrifice. None imagined the bruises hidden beneath her nightdress, the scalded patches of skin where boiling water had splashed, the welts across her thighs where he tested her flesh with heated spoons to measure sensitivity. He told himself she could feel none of it. That pain was a test meant only for him, but deep down he knew he inflicted harm with purpose. It reminded him he was keeper and judge. Silas began to speak to her as though she answered. At supper, he sat beside her bed, whispering questions, then nodding as if her silence confirmed his wisdom. Sometimes he laughed softly as though sharing secrets. Other nights he grew angry, accusing her of trying to leave him, slamming his fists against the wall until plaster cracked. When neighbors asked after her, he replied that she was improving, that she spoke to him when others were gone, and they nodded politely, too afraid to challenge him. His devotion had become a wall none dared climb. By the end of the decade, his chamber was no longer a place of rest, but a theater of endless rites. The air reeked of vinegar and scorched cloth. The bed was damp more often than dry as he poured herbal tinctures over her skin, certain each one kept demons from settling in her flesh. He cut her with needles to watch the speed of clotting, muttering that her blood spoke in codes only he could read. He stitched the wounds with coarse thread, leaving scars that mapped across her body like rivers. Outside, people still admired his sacrifice. They said no man could love a sister more, that he lived like a monk chained to a holy duty. But inside the locked chamber, love had been stripped of tenderness. What remained was ritual without mercy, a devotion sharpened into cruelty. And with each passing year, Silas drifted further into the belief that his sister belonged not to God nor to the world, but to him alone. The house still breathed, the bed still radiated heat, and the woman still slept. Yet devotion had shifted into possession, and possession into desecration. The line between care and cruelty was gone, and what remained would only darken with time. By 1863, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. The story of the sleeping woman had traveled beyond Montpellier, carried on the tongues of preachers and traveling merchants, until it reached the ears of physicians at Dartmouth and Boston. Letters arrived on thick parchment, each politely requesting permission to examine the case. Silas Harlow responded with care, always agreeing, but only on the condition that no notes be published without his consent. He wrote that his sister's condition was not merely medical but spiritual, and that loose tongues might place her soul in danger. The doctors agreed, each thinking themselves strong enough to separate superstition from science. Yet one by one they entered the farmhouse, and one by one they left altered. The first was a professor from Dartmouth, a man who lectured on the nervous system and believed in electricity as cure. He arrived with wires, batteries, and a gleaming galvanic device, speaking with the confidence of a man certain he would expose fraud. Silas led him into the locked chamber and allowed him to touch her skin with the metal probes. For a moment the woman's fingers curled, her eyelids fluttered, and the professor's confidence faltered. He repeated the test with greater current, but her reaction grew stranger. Her mouth trembled, and a low moan escaped, not like pain, but like something wordless pulled from deep beneath the lungs. The sound unnerved him so badly he dropped the instruments onto the floor and refused to continue. He left that same night without his batteries, his face as pale as chalk. He never returned, and within weeks he abandoned his lectures on galvanism altogether. The second physician came from Boston, a younger man with ambition who sought to make his name. He spoke of hysteria, of cataleptic trances, of the power of suggestion. He pressed needles into her flesh at precise points, watching for reflex. When she did not stir, he tried again with deeper force. Her skin resisted in a way that unsettled him, as though the body held itself together with unnatural strength. Then her eyes opened for the briefest instant. They did not see, did not focus, but rolled back until only the whites showed. He staggered backward, insisting it was only reflex, but the sight left him shaking. That evening he vomited in Silas's yard and begged to leave before nightfall. He forgot his medical bag inside the chamber, and Silas kept it, adding the polished tools to his growing collection beside her bed. A third came soon after, older and less sure of himself, persuaded by his colleagues to give an opinion. He spent only minutes in the chamber. When he placed a stethoscope to her chest, he claimed he heard more than one rhythm, as if another pulse beat faintly beneath her own. He muttered that he had listened to thousands of hearts and never once heard a sound like that. His hands trembled so violently he could not pack his satchel. He left his stethoscope behind and never asked for it back. He returned to Boston and resigned from his practice, telling friends that he no longer believed medicine could explain the world. Each visitor came with confidence, but none left with it intact. They whispered of mesmerism, of hysteria, of divine punishment, but always in hushed tones, never in letters, never in journals. To speak of it plainly was to bind their name to something obscene, and so they retreated into silence. A few sent short notes weeks later apologizing for their abrupt departure but offering no explanation. One mailed Silas a sum of money, begging him to use it for the woman's care and pleading never to be mentioned. Their reputations remained intact, but their hands never touched patience with the same certainty again. Silas watched them come and go with quiet satisfaction. He told himself their fear was proof that his care alone was righteous. He began to believe that God had chosen him, not them, to keep her balanced between the two worlds. When they left their instruments behind, he stored them carefully, polishing the metal until it shone. He arranged them on shelves around her bed like relics, convinced each bore witness to her sacred endurance. The chamber grew more crowded, more suffocating, lined with jars of hair, ledgers of breath counts, and the gleam of abandoned tools. What seemed like a sick room to outsiders became a sanctum to him. The villagers noticed the pattern. Doctors arrived in fine carriages and left on foot, refusing to explain. Some avoided the main road, cutting across fields in haste, pale as though they had glimpsed plague. They told no tales in taverns, gave no lectures in halls. Their silence fed the unease that hung over the valley. The farmhouse, once dismissed as a curiosity, now seemed a place touched by something that should not be named. Mothers pulled their children close when passing by. Men muttered that the doctor's fear proved the devil's hand, while women whispered that perhaps it was not the devil at all, but something far older. Inside, the woman slept. Her chest rose and fell with unnatural calm, her skin untouched by years. Silas continued his rituals, unmoved by their terror, convinced it only confirmed his holy charge. Yet in the shadows of the chamber, among the abandoned instruments and thickening journals, the line between science and faith had already rotted away. Care had become ritual. Ritual had become obsession, and obsession was leading him into darkness no physician dared to confront. When the doctors stopped coming, Silas Harlow decided their silence was permission. If they would not commit their findings to paper, then he alone must. He no longer trusted their instruments left behind, though he polished them as carefully as any relic. He believed their fear proved that he alone could bear the weight of her condition, that God had not chosen physicians or scholars, but a brother who would not look away. It was then that his rituals of care slid into experiments. He had kept her alive for a decade, and he now convinced himself that her soul hovered in some half-world, reaching toward him in fragments. He told himself that if he could record every twitch and every flicker of breath, he could translate her silence into words. It began with the needle. He selected the finest among the abandoned tools, sharpened it against wet stone until its tip glimmered in the candlelight, and pressed it beneath her fingernails. The flesh resisted, then yielded. He timed the welling of blood with his pocket watch, writing the exact seconds into his ledger. If the blood came quickly, he wrote that her spirit was near the surface. If it lingered, he marked that she had retreated deeper into her dreams. He pierced each finger, then each toe, sometimes repeating the process multiple times in a single day. The journals thickened with columns of numbers, rows of precise marks that he studied like scripture. But numbers were not enough. He began to experiment with fluids. Laudanum first, drawn from the apothecary in town, thinned with water and pushed into her veins through a hollow quill. He noted every tremor, every flutter of eyelid, treating them not as reflex but as messages. A twitch in her left hand was agreement. A tightening of her jaw was protest. A spasm in her calf was laughter. He believed he was learning her language, a language only he was patient enough to hear. When laudanum no longer satisfied him, he turned to mercury, convinced it could tether her spirit. He injected drops slowly, then waited for her body to shiver. The metal burned through her veins, leaving her lips tinged gray, but still she breathed. Silas recorded it as proof that she was stronger than ordinary flesh, preserved by his devotion. The journals became prayers written by a surgeon's hand. He no longer wrote her name, but called her the vessel. He described his methods as offerings, his needles as keys. He wrote of her silence as a locked door that only pain could open, though he did not name it pain. He called it inquiry, purification, devotion. Each act was justified, each wound sanctified. He no longer questioned whether it harmed her, because to him harm was impossible. She was beyond harm, he believed, resting in a half-world where every drop of blood was a gift to him. At night he sat beside her bed, reading his entries aloud as if reciting psalms. His voice shook with awe as he listed the minutes her blood had taken to clot, the number of spasms in her left arm, the time her eyelids trembled in rhythm with his spoken prayers. He heard patterns where none existed, drawing constellations of meaning across the silence. He became convinced that she was guiding him, instructing him to continue, to deepen the wounds, to widen the scope of his trials. He told himself that each injection was not cruelty but communication, each drop of mercury a message from her dreaming soul. The room changed with him. The air grew heavy with the metallic scent of spilled blood and scorched cloth. Needles clattered into jars, each labeled with the date of use, preserved like relics. Stained rags stiffened on the floor, never discarded because he feared throwing them away would scatter her spirit into the world. The mattress sagged beneath her weight and his, soaked through with tinctures and blood. But he refused to replace it. It had become a sacred ground, the altar upon which he alone could minister. From the outside, the house still seemed quiet, the curtains still drawn, the figure of Silas still bent in care. Villagers saw only a devoted brother, patient beyond reason, guarding a mystery. They did not know the truth. That devotion had hardened into ritual torture, hidden beneath the guise of love. They did not smell the blood thickening in jars, did not hear the scrape of quill inside vein, did not see the charts where every spasm was catalogued like divine instruction. Silas believed himself chosen, and chosen men do not rest. Each experiment left him more certain that she was not simply sleeping but suspended, held in place by his hand. He grew gaunt, sleepless, fevered with conviction. His journals multiplied until the chamber resembled a courtroom, every act of cruelty recorded as evidence of holy duty. He no longer doubted, he no longer feared. He only pressed forward deeper into the silence, convinced that in the trembling of her flesh he would one day hear her voice. And when that day came, he told himself, the world would understand that what others called cruelty had been devotion all along. By 1870, the quiet fascination around the Harlow farmhouse had hardened into fear. The villagers had long grown used to the sight of Silas walking to town with his head bent, his clothes stiff with lye from endless boiling. They pitied him once, called him a man of sacrifice, but pity is fragile, and when children began to vanish, it snapped. The disappearances were small at first. A boy fetching water from a stream who never returned. A girl who lingered on the road after church and was not seen again. The searches began with lanterns sweeping through fields, with mothers calling until their voices broke. Yet no bodies surfaced, no tracks explained their absence. The forest was wide and the river fast, but something darker gnawed at the villagers' minds. Whispers grew. They said Silas had taken them, that the locked house on the ridge had swallowed the children whole. The rumors carried weight because of what they had already seen. The bed that never cooled, the endless journals, the doctors who would not speak. It was easier to believe that the same hidden power which kept his sister breathing demanded sacrifice. They said he fed her not just milk and tinctures, but the lives of children, that their warmth was drained to keep her flesh supple. Their breath pressed into her lungs as she lay silent. No one dared accuse him openly. But mothers began pulling their children close when passing his lane, and fathers forbade play in the meadow below the house. Inside, the truth was worse than whispers. Silas had convinced himself that his sister's silence could not be sustained by ritual alone. Her flesh trembled differently when new blood had entered the house. He measured her pulse before and after, convinced it grew steadier when children were near. He lured them first with kindness, with apples from his orchard or promises of books his sister once read. When they stepped inside, curiosity softening their fear, he locked the door and led them to the chamber. There he pressed their hands to hers, whispering that she could feel them, that their warmth was her breath. The children cried, tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. He told himself their fear was proof of the offering, that innocence resisted because it knew it was being claimed for higher purpose. The methods of their deaths were not swift. He drained their breath by pressing cloth over their mouths, timing each muffled cry with his pocket watch as though measuring the rhythm of their lives. He cut them with precision, taking blood into jars he later warmed by the hearth before feeding drops into his sister's lips. He broke bones carefully, never in haste, because he believed the sound released a measure of the soul. Each act was written into his journals in the same steady hand that once recorded her pulse, numbers, and notes marked with reverence. He called them donations, as though each child had given freely. When their bodies cooled, he did not bury them in earth. He hid them within the walls of the farmhouse, wrapping each set of bones in cloth embroidered with his sister's initials. He believed their spirits were now bound to her, their heat pressed into her chest forever. The walls grew thick with silence, every hidden skeleton another voice smothered. The house itself began to feel swollen, as though its beams carried not just weight but memory. At night, Silas swore he could hear faint knocks within the plaster, the echo of children still calling for their mothers. Rather than frighten him, it reassured him. He told himself their cries proved they had been accepted, that they had joined her in the half-world where she slept. The villagers never found proof, but suspicion rooted deep. Each missing child was another nail driven into the legend of the farmhouse. They said the house breathed because lungs were hidden in its walls. They said the silence around it was not peace, but the hush of children gagged forever. No one confronted him for fear of what they might see if the door opened. Instead, they avoided the ridge altogether, watching from afar as the smoke rose at odd hours, thin and acrid, carrying with it the smell of cloth and marrow. Still she slept. Still her skin glowed with warmth. And still Silas recorded every detail in his ledgers, as though the suffering of children was not horror, but proof that his devotion was working. The house had become a shrine of preserved silence, every bone and every drop of blood serving his twisted faith. And in that silence, he convinced himself, God had spoken. By the middle of the 1870s, the farmhouse had changed again. The ridge at night wore a strange crown, a faint glow pulsing through the shutters long after midnight. It was too white for oil, too steady for fire, and the villagers whispered that the panes themselves breathed. Children who peered too long swore they saw the house blink, a flash of cold blue before darkness returned. To them it seemed alive, the walls exhaling a ghostly radiance. Inside, Silas Harlow had built his own sun. He scavenged tin and broken mirrors, arranged them into crude reflectors, and fed the box with oil lamps and strips of magnesium bought from a traveling photographer. When lit, the chamber turned into harsh daylight, shadows sharpening to blades. He called it purity. He told himself that light was life, that if he could bathe her body in this new sun, her flesh would drink it and remain young. He recorded the minutes of exposure like psalm numbers, convinced that the glow did not burn but blessed. But light was not enough. He had learned the old craft of the tanners who worked hides by the river, listening with quiet hunger as they spoke of lime to loosen hair, knives to scrape flesh, alum to preserve, salt to dry. They laughed at his questions, thinking him curious about boots or saddles. He took their lessons home and turned them into sacraments. He did not want leather. He wanted skin, pale and supple, to lay across his sister's chest. He began with the dead he had already hidden in his walls. In the damp cellar, he steamed their limbs until the outer layer slid free like gloves. He peeled slowly, whispering the Lord's Prayer as he worked, pinning the strips to wooden frames, washing them in alum water, brushing them with egg white for sheen. When dried, the strips crackled like parchment when bent, and he felt pride, as though he had written scripture in flesh. The cruelty did not end with the dead. He believed living warmth carried a charge the dead could not. He lured a boy who lingered near his fence, keeping him alive for 2 days in a corner pen under the lamps. He smothered him with cloth until his eyes glazed, then lifted the fabric and counted his way back to breath. He painted the boy's arms with caustic paste, watching the skin bubble and split. He dabbed the sweat that rose with a feather and touched it to his sister's lips, whispering that the child was feeding her. On the second night, he tied the boy's arm tight, cut a thin ring of skin from the wrist and warmed it under the lamp before laying it across her collarbone. The boy's chest slowed, his voice fell to silence, and Silas thanked him for his donation before peeling what he needed. From these acts he fashioned garments not for himself but for her. He stitched strips into shawls and squares into blankets, sewing with her own hair twisted into thread. He soaked the coverings in milk before placing them on her, believing milk would draw out the youth in the tissue. Under the glare of his lamps the coverings glistened, and he felt the old thrill of control, the sense that numbers in his ledger obeyed his desire. He wrote that her pulse steadied, that her breath grew deeper, and he never questioned whether he measured what was real or only what he needed to believe. The farmhouse reeked of quicklime, singed hair, and sour milk. The shutters warped from heat, the shelves crowded with jars labeled in his careful hand. He stretched thin flitches of skin across frames and hung them like paper lanterns along the walls. When the lamps flared at night, they glowed amber, and the whole house pulsed as though it had veins of its own. Villagers looked up from their beds to see the glow and muttered that the devil had pitched his tent on the ridge. A few men spoke of forcing the lock, but none could move past the dread of what they might find. Silas pressed forward without fear. He warmed stones in the oven, wrapped them in fresh bands of skin, and lined them along her ribs. He soaked strips in blood mixed with oak bark tea and bound them tight around her wrists and ankles, telling himself he was tying her to life. He shaved her arms, sealed them with a glaze of egg, glycerin, and mercury salts to keep her smooth, and turned her as carefully as a craftsman turning a book. When cracks formed, he patched them with new cloth. When blemishes appeared, he scraped them away with lye. Every act was written, every act justified. He needed more living warmth. A girl vanished from the church lane and was brought to the bed, made to stand barefoot beneath the lamps until her skin flushed. He pressed her small hands to the veil, stitched of skin across his sister's chest, and counted as the heat sank through. When she swayed, he steadied her. When she moaned, he took it as consent. He packed caustic-soaked rags under her knees to draw the warmth upward, measuring with the back of his hand how her glow transferred. He wrote that living heat surpassed the dead. When she collapsed, he cut quickly, laying fresh ribbons of skin across the chest of the sleeper. He recorded the curves of cooling flesh against the slowing rhythm of his sister's pulse, convinced the numbers spoke to one another. The ritual consumed him. His hands cracked from lye, his eyes blurred from glare, his voice rasped from the fumes. He no longer saw his neighbors as people, but as squandered heat, their lives wasting into air. He resented their laughter, their breath, their children, as though they hoarded what belonged to her. He ate standing, slept rarely, and sometimes woke with needles in his hand, the lamp still burning, the ledger open on his chest. He had crossed lines until lines no longer existed. What he called devotion had become industry. An assembly of torment devoted to one silent body. Still the bed breathed. Still the house glowed on certain nights, a lantern on the ridge, and word of that glow traveled far until it reached a physician in London known for his severity and silence, a man tied to the court of a queen. While Silas pinned another pale sheet to dry, a letter was sealed across the ocean, and the path to the next witness began to open. By 1882, the Harlow farmhouse had become legend, a ghost on the ridge that glowed some nights and wept silence on others. Stories carried far, whispered by preachers, traders, and the rare physician who had seen too much and said too little. It was through such whispers that word reached London, where Queen Victoria's court physician, Sir William Gull, was planning a discreet tour of America. Officially, he was visiting institutions for nervous ailments, but in truth, he sought curiosities, cases that blurred the border between medicine and miracle. He heard of the woman who had slept for 20 years, yet whose skin had not aged, whose warmth defied time. Curiosity overcame caution. He arranged a visit without fanfare, his name concealed in letters of introduction. Silas welcomed him. He had grown thinner with years of ritual, his eyes hollow but still burning with certainty. He dressed in black, brushed his hair back neatly, and bowed like a servant opening the gate of a shrine. To Gull he appeared a weary guardian, a brother burdened with holy duty. But the chamber told the truth. The stench of lye, vinegar, and charred fat filled the air. The shelves sagged with jars of clotted fluid, rows of needles, bundles of cloth stiffened with blood. Frames stretched with pale, cured sheets hung along the walls, glowing faintly in the dim lamplight. The bed stood at the center, draped in coverings stitched of flesh and hair. And upon it lay the woman unchanged, her cheeks still soft, her lips faintly pink, her chest rising in slow, deliberate rhythm. Gull approached with the composure of a man long hardened by sickness and death. He touched her wrist and found warmth, not the slack coolness of a corpse. He pressed his ear to her chest and heard a heartbeat steady as a drum, no faster than it had been described decades earlier. He drew back, studying the skin of her arms and face, and saw no withering, no dryness, only a strange preservation, as if time had been forced to halt. His hand hovered above her cheek but did not touch, for he sensed something resistant in the flesh, something that recoiled from contact. Silas stood near, explaining with quiet pride the rituals of light and care, speaking of hours counted, of breath measured, of purity drawn from children whose warmth had been freely given. Gull understood enough to feel the shadow of truth behind the words. He saw in the walls the faint bulges where bodies had been sealed. He recognized the tools of dissection repurposed for ritual. And he knew what stains lingered on the floorboards. Yet he said nothing. He asked only questions of method, of time, of sequence, and wrote nothing in his notebook. His eyes betrayed little, though his lips trembled once when Silas described peeling strips of skin and laying them across her chest as gifts of borrowed youth. He left the chamber pale but upright, his reputation stitched tight across his composure. That evening, in the parlor of a local inn, he confided only a fragment to a fellow traveler. He said that science must never disturb what God had chained, that some conditions existed not for cure but for silence. He warned that to probe too deeply was to risk unleashing what should remain sealed. He did not name the farmhouse, nor the woman, nor the brother. His words were vague, cloaked in sermon-like caution, but they carried the weight of authority. The listener repeated them, and so the warning traveled back across the sea to London, where it entered drawing rooms and lecture halls as rumor, never as fact. For Silas, Gull's silence was victory. The presence of a royal physician had confirmed what he long believed, that no man of learning could deny the sanctity of his work. He told himself that the silence of doctors proved reverence, that their fear was awe, that their retreat was submission. He polished the instruments Gull had touched, storing them among his collection as relics. He wrote in his ledger that the world had now witnessed and had not interfered, that his guardianship was divine. Yet Gull carried the truth with him like a fever. In London he continued his duties, his reputation untarnished, his name spoken with respect in court and society. But he never published on the case, never mentioned it in his lectures. He avoided discussions of trance, catalepsy, or preservation as though the memory lay too close to poison. Some colleagues noted that he grew quieter in his later years, more cautious in pronouncements, and more willing to let mysteries stand unchallenged. His silence was not ignorance but shield. The farmhouse remained on the ridge, glowing at odd hours, its bed still warm, its walls still heavy with bones. The villagers spoke less openly now, for the visit of an English physician seemed to sanctify what they feared. They told themselves that if a man of the Queen had seen and said nothing, then perhaps silence was safer than truth. And so the rituals continued, the bed never cooling, the woman never waking, the brother never doubting. The evil lived on, hidden not only by the walls of the farmhouse, but by the silence of men who chose reputation over revelation. By the 1890s, Silas Harlow was a shadow of the man who once bent his head politely to neighbors. His body had withered into angles, his cheeks sunken, his lips cracked from years of inhaling fumes that rose from tinctures and chemicals. His hair fell in brittle strands, his nails blackened, yet his eyes still blazed with the fever of certainty. He lived no longer as a man, but as a vessel for his rituals, every waking hour consumed by the rhythm of numbers, by the search for signs in his sister's stillness. He kept no watch on seasons, no count of years, only the ledger of her breath and his own blood. The farmhouse became a furnace of smoke and stench. Silas burned herbs in great heaps, sage and wormwood and roots ground into powder, convinced the rising haze kept demons from stealing her spirit. The smoke clung to the beams until the air was never clear, a haze that stung the eyes and choked the throat. He scrawled protective symbols in the soot across her walls, crooked circles, endless spirals, crosses drawn upside down. Not as rebellion, but as code. He spoke aloud as he wrote them, whispering numbers in endless succession. 17, then 3, then 9, then silence, then again, as though her breath only continued if he counted correctly. His flesh bore the rituals as much as hers. He cut patterns into his own arms with razors, neat lines forming grids, circles, and runes that bled onto the floor. He measured the blood in cups, then smeared it across her chest, believing his veins fed her like roots. His scars crossed and thickened, his skin becoming a map of devotion. When blood did not flow freely, he forced it, binding his arm tight with cord until the veins swelled purple, then lanced them with trembling hands. He filled jars with what spilled, labeling them in his steady script. For her. Each jar lined the shelves beside her bed, glowing dark red in the lamplight like organs torn from invisible bodies. At night he lay beside her, not in lust but in worship. He pressed his head to her shoulder and whispered numbers, sometimes for hours without pause. He believed his breath entered her when he spoke, that his counting was the rhythm that kept her lungs moving. When exhaustion dragged him into sleep, he clutched her hand as though to anchor himself. If he woke to find her still, he wept with joy, marking the date in his ledger with words of thanksgiving. If she twitched or moaned faintly, he recorded it as prophecy. He wrote that she was close to waking, that the veil between worlds was thinning, though it never broke. The townsfolk grew uneasy when weeks passed without seeing him in the lane. No smoke rose from the chimney by day, only faint glimmers by night, and the air carried the metallic tang of burnt herbs and blood. They whispered that the house was no longer a dwelling but a tomb, and some said they heard chanting carried down the ridge on the wind. When at last a group of men forced the door, they found a silence so heavy it seemed to press against their lungs. The chamber told the truth. The woman lay as she had for decades, her cheeks soft, her skin warm, her chest rising in slow, endless rhythm. Beside her, stretched across the bed, was Silas. His body was pale and sunken, his skin carved with fresh cuts, his arms limp. Around him stood rows of jars, each brimming with dark blood, corked and labeled in his careful hand. For her, for her, for her. The cords he had tied around his arms still hung loose. Soaked through, the veins collapsed beneath. He had bled himself until nothing remained, drained not in a frenzy but methodically day by day until his heart could no longer beat. His lips were parted, his face turned toward her as though he had fallen asleep beside her, whispering numbers to the very end. The men did not speak as they lifted him away. Some crossed themselves, others turned their faces from the shelves of jars. They were struck not only by his death but by her persistence. For she lived. Her body lay untouched by time, her skin preserved, her warmth unbroken. She breathed still, steady as a metronome, as though the years of blood and ritual had only deepened her trance. The silence of that chamber shook them more than his corpse, for it meant his devotion had not failed. It meant she remained bound, suspended, and that whatever power had held her through decades had not released her even with his death. They carried Silas into the yard, the jars left behind, the smoke still clinging to the rafters. No words could frame what they had seen. They whispered only that he had given himself for her, that he had poured out his veins until he lay empty. Yet she endured. The farmhouse did not breathe that night, but the bed still did. And the woman remained, silent as ever, her skin glowing faintly under the lamplight, as if death itself could not approach while she slept. When Silas Harlow's body was buried, the villagers believed the nightmare was finished. They told themselves that whatever sickness had haunted the farmhouse would end with him, that the woman in the bed would fade naturally now that her guardian was gone. But the house itself resisted closure. The smell of smoke and chemicals lingered, and the shutters rattled at night, though no one touched them. The local authorities, urged by neighbors and unsettled by rumor, decided to search the house thoroughly. They expected filth, perhaps more jars of blood, perhaps some forgotten traces of ritual. What they found instead was a hidden world built on cruelty, a museum of torment designed by a mind that had given itself wholly to darkness. The first discovery came when a deputy pried open a panel near the chamber where the woman slept. Behind it lay a narrow corridor of wood and lime, silent as a crypt. The men carried lanterns and advanced slowly, their boots crunching over what they thought was plaster. It was not plaster. It was bone ground to powder, scattered across the floor like dust. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy door, bolted and chained from the outside. The men broke the lock with hammers, bracing themselves, and pulled it open. The light revealed rows of skeletons arranged like worshippers in a church, their skulls tilted forward as though in eternal prayer. The bones had been wired together, joints bound with twine, ribs tightened against spines until they sat upright in neat order. Each skull bore carvings etched deep into the bone, spirals, runes, numbers, and crude letters. Some marks appeared to be dates, others sequences, still others unknown symbols that repeated across multiple skulls as though Silas had been recording experiments on them as faithfully as he did his ledgers. The sight silenced the men. They did not step forward at once, but stood staring, unable to decide whether they had found victims or congregants. As they examined further, they saw that each skeleton's chest cavity had been split and wired open, leaving a hollow space where lungs once lay. In several, jars had been placed inside the cages, their corks rotted, their contents evaporated to residue. One deputy whispered that Silas had been trying to catch breath itself, to weigh the soul in glass as it left the body. Along one wall lay scales blackened with use, their pans crusted with dried matter. Numbers were etched into the wooden beams above them, tallies that stretched upward in sequences no one could decipher. The journals told the rest. They were stacked on shelves and piled on the floor, thousands of pages written in Silas's steady hand. The entries were not confessions but calculations, as cold as ledgers. He wrote of the seconds between a child's final gasp and the collapse of its pulse, the precise weight of a heart removed before cooling, the way marrow lost mass if left in open air. He described experiments in which he pressed cloth over mouths and timed the fading cries, then cut open the chest to weigh the lungs immediately after. He wrote that some weighed more, some less, and concluded that the soul must be measurable, though it slipped too fast for certainty. He called the failures lessons and promised the vessel, his sister, that he would improve. In another set of entries, he detailed how he carved into skulls to test resonance. He tapped the bone with metal rods, noting the tones they produced, believing the sound carried remnants of memory. He described how he cut patterns into the bone, then tapped again, listening for changes. He wrote that certain symbols deepened the pitch, others thinned it, and that these were messages from the half-world where she drifted. He believed the skulls were choir stalls, each voice tuned to the frequency of her dreaming flesh. The officials read only a fraction before closing the books in horror. Some vomited, some crossed themselves, others simply stood staring at the rows of bones. They realized they were not in a laboratory but a chapel built on mutilation. Silas had not killed in rage or haste. He had killed methodically, carefully, each death a note in his twisted hymn. The victims had not been discarded but arranged, their bodies preserved as instruments of a ritual he believed eternal. The decision came quickly. The journals were locked away, the details omitted from public record. Reports described only disturbing evidence without elaboration. The skeletons were removed quietly and buried in an unmarked trench, the carvings left unspoken. To publish the truth, they said, would spread madness, would invite imitation. The house itself was boarded and left to rot, its windows sealed, its doors chained, as though silence could erase what had been found. Yet silence could not smother memory. The men who entered that room carried its images for the rest of their lives. They spoke of it rarely, only in hushed warnings, but the dread never left them. They knew they had uncovered not just murder, but a system of evil. A man who turned devotion into doctrine, pain into prayer. The house had become a vault of evidence too disturbing to publish, too corrosive to let breathe. And inside that vault, above the locked room, the woman still lay sleeping, her chest rising steady, her skin untouched by age, as if the choir of bones below sang only for her. In the summer of 1902, 40 years after she first collapsed in prayer, the woman on the bed finally died. Her chest rose and fell with its usual patience until one evening it did not rise again. Her brother had long since bled himself to death beside her, and the house had already been searched, its hidden rooms exposed, its walls stripped of their choir of bones. Yet the woman endured until her final breath, her body never yielding to age. When the doctor from Montpellier placed his hand to her wrist, he recoiled. Her skin was soft, her face unchanged, her lips faintly colored as if she were still alive. She looked no older than the day she first closed her eyes. The men present argued in hushed tones, their voices breaking under the weight of what they saw. Some demanded an autopsy, certain that her body would reveal the secret of her unnatural preservation. Others refused, trembling at the thought of what might be cut open. They remembered the journals, the carved skulls, the jars labeled for her, and none wished to carry the stain of such knowledge further. In the end, they agreed to bury her whole, untouched, as though mutilating the body would invite her brother's spirit back into the house. They lowered her into the ground with simple words, a plain pine coffin without inscription. The earth closed over her, but the silence did not. Fear spread quickly through Vermont. The story reached Boston, then New York, and soon became a national panic. Newspapers printed vague accounts of a woman who slept for 40 years, of a brother's devotion that had masked cruelty, of bones hidden in walls and experiments too grotesque to describe. They never printed the details, for the officials refused to release them, but the whispers filled the gaps. Parents warned children against wandering after dark. Preachers thundered against secret experiments and godless science. Legislators in Montpellier, under pressure from the outcry, passed laws forbidding unlicensed medical trials, declaring that no human body could be used in experiment without the sanction of the state. The law was thin, easily bent, but it was the first of its kind in Vermont, born not of science, but of terror. The house itself did not survive. Within a year of her burial, a group of locals carried torches up the ridge. They broke the chains, doused the walls with kerosene, and lit the match. The fire roared through the timbers, feeding on old stains, curling the frames stretched with skin until they blackened and fell. Some swore they heard screams from inside, though no one lived there anymore. Others said the flames burned too bright, as if eager to consume the secrets hidden in the wood. By morning, only the chimney remained, a blackened pillar against the sky. The land was left to weeds, the soil never tilled again. Yet the past was not erased. The journals, stacked in crates and carried away before the fire, were divided between the courthouse and the university at Burlington. The officials read them only in part before locking them away. They decided the public would never see the full contents, not for fear of disbelief, but for fear of imitation. The fragments that remain even today are sealed in vaults, bound with warnings, their pages too disturbing for students to touch. Researchers speak of them in whispers, describing them only as the Harlow Papers, a collection so corrosive it must remain hidden. A few claim to have seen copies smuggled out, thin pages of cramped handwriting that describe the weighing of lungs, the carving of skulls, the draining of children, but none admit to keeping them. The threat of silence hangs heavier than the risk of exposure. A memorial was raised in Montpellier, not to the Harlow family, but to the unnamed dead. A stone stands in a small green carved with simple words, "For the lost whose names were taken." People leave flowers there on certain nights, though no one explains why. The stone is both confession and denial, acknowledgement without detail. Vermont chose to remember without speaking, to honor without describing. It is the same silence that surrounded the farmhouse for decades, the same silence that shielded the doctors, the same silence that let a brother turn devotion into desecration without interruption. And yet silence is not empty. It carries weight. It moves like breath through generations. Evil lived in that house, not in rage, but in silence, dressed as care, wrapped in ritual, masked by duty. Silas did not shout his crimes. He recorded them in steady ink, convinced that cruelty was service, that torment was devotion. He hid his madness behind the appearance of love, and the world allowed it, too afraid to name what it saw. His sister's youth was preserved not by miracle, but by the systematic harvesting of others, the theft of warmth and breath turned into daily prayer. The cost was hidden in walls, sealed in jars, buried under numbers. And when the house fell, The silence remained. Even today, fragments of the journals exist, held in locked collections, their words sealed from public eyes. Some say the pages still reek faintly of blood, that the ink has not faded, that the numbers run in patterns no one can interpret. Archivists confess that students have begged to read them, drawn by curiosity, but the answer is always no. The papers remain hidden as though truth itself is poison. In silence, the memory endures, not as warning, but as shadow. The story of Silas and his sister is less about what he did than about how the world responded. Neighbors who looked away, doctors who would not speak, officials who hid the journals, a society that chose erasure over revelation. What he created was not only a chamber of cruelty, but a mirror of how evil survives, not with violence alone, but with silence. It was silence that kept her alive, silence that fed his madness, silence that allowed the house to breathe death for 40 years. And so the question lingers, heavy as the air that once hung in that chamber. What do you think? Could this happen again? Behind locked doors, behind curtains drawn, in the silence where no one dares to look?